The insult struck Ilara not like a whip, but like a cold stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of it, the quiet, pitying glances and stifled whispers from the other villagers in the market square, were the real punishment. Honestly, Ilara, her sister Lyra's voice was honey-laced poison, loud enough for half the square to hear. Still wearing those drab colours. You look like a field mouse trying to hide from a hawk. No wonder you have no prospects. Lyra, ever the peacock, preened in her vibrant blue dress, a stark contrast to Ilara's simple earth-toned tunic and cloak. Ilara did not look up from the bundle of herbs she was examining. She felt the weight of her sister's judgment, a familiar burden she had carried since their family's name had fallen from grace. They were Omegas from a tarnished line, but Lyra fought against that reality with sharp words and social climbing, while Ilara simply endured it. She refused to give Lyra the satisfaction of a reaction. To argue would be to engage in her sister's cruel theatre. To weep would be to prove her right. So, she remained still, her face a careful mask of neutrality, her spine straight with a dignity they could not strip from her. "At least a field mouse has a purpose," Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear, not meant for the crowd but for herself. She placed a few coins on the vendor's stall, gathered her meagre purchases, and turned to leave, ignoring the furious narrowing of her sister's eyes. She did not run. She walked, each step deliberate, away from the stifling judgment of the village, and toward the cool, silent embrace of the woods that bordered their small territory. The trees did not judge. The wind did not whisper insults. Here, she was not a failed Omega from a disgraced line. She was just a soul breathing the air, far away, in a fortress of polished granite and chilling silence. The Alpha King Kale stood before a vast arched window. Below him, his kingdom spread like a map, bustling with life he could observe but never truly feel. A delicate, crystalline frost feathered the edges of the windowpane, despite the warmth of the summer afternoon. The cold did not come from the outside. It emanated from him. It was a curse, a century-old parasite of ice that had latched onto his soul and bled him dry of all warmth, all emotion. He was a king of immense power, his dominion absolute, his word law. His subjects feared him, respected his unyielding and brutally efficient rule, but they did not love him. How could they? He was a figure carved from winter, his heart a frozen stone in his chest. He could not even remember the warmth of the sun on his skin, the taste of a hot meal, or the fire of a true alpha's rage. There was only the cold, an endless internal winter. The curse had taken more than just his feelings. It had stolen his other half. For 100 years, he had been unable to shift. The great black wolf that was the symbol of his royal line, the primal core of his being, was trapped within him, silenced and encased in ice. He was a king, but he was only half a man. He ruled with logic because it was all he had left. Compassion, anger, joy, love, they were foreign words from a forgotten language. He felt a phantom ache of loneliness sometimes, a hollow space where his heart should be, but even that was a distant, muted echo. He was numb. And he was so tired. Back in the forest, Ilara wandered deeper, letting the dappled sunlight and the scent of damp earth wash away the lingering sting of the marketplace. She came to a small clearing where a stream trickled over mossy stones. And there, she heard it. A faint, distressed whimper. Her head snapped up, her senses instantly alert. It was the sound of a pup, a very young one, by the thin, reedy quality of its cry. She followed the noise to the base of an ancient oak, its roots like gnarled knuckles gripping the soil. Curled in a hollow between two roots was a tiny ball of black fur. It was a wolf pup, no bigger than her two hands put together, shivering violently. Its eyes were barely open, clouded with the milky blue of infancy. There was no sign of a mother, no scent of a nearby pack. It was utterly, terrifyingly alone. A fierce, protective instinct flared in Ilara's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. This was a life, fragile and abandoned. Without a second thought, she knelt, her movements slow and non-threatening. "Hello, little one," she murmured, her voice a soft hum. "Where is your mother?" The pup whimpered again, a pathetic sound that tore at her heart. She gently scooped it up. It was so light, its tiny body trembling against her palms. She drew it close, tucking it into the folds of her woolen cloak, against the warmth of her own body. The shivering lessened almost immediately as it burrowed into the fabric, seeking comfort. She knew the risks. A lost pup meant a distraught, likely dangerous, mother was somewhere nearby. But leaving it here to perish was not an option. It was anathema to her very nature. She spent the rest of the day walking the forest, calling out softly, not for a person, but for a she-wolf. She kept to the less travelled paths, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She did not want to draw attention. The king's law was clear about wolves near the village. They were to be reported, and often hunted. She couldn't bear the thought of this tiny creature's family meeting such a fate. But the woods remained silent. No answering howl came. No scent of a pack reached her. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The pup had fallen asleep in her cloak, its tiny breaths a faint, rhythmic puff against her skin. Hope dwindling, she turned back toward her cottage on the edge of the village. Night had fully fallen by the time she reached her small thatched roof home. Inside, the single room was sparse but clean. She barred the door, lit a single candle, and gently placed the pup on a soft blanket near the hearth. It stirred, yawned, and looked up at her with trusting dark eyes. She found a bit of leftover broth and painstakingly fed it from her fingertips, which it licked with a surprisingly rough tongue. A strange sense of peace settled over her. For one day, she had not been the disgraced Omega. She had been a protector. She had a purpose. Then, the feeling shattered. An immense pressure descended upon her little cottage, so heavy and absolute it felt like the sky was collapsing. The air grew instantly, unnaturally cold. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing, terrified shadows. The pup began to whine, pressing itself against her leg. Before she could even process the feeling, the wooden bar on her door splintered with a sound like cracking bone. The door swung inward with a silent, dreadful finality. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, a man so large he seemed to fill the entire frame. He was darkness and shadow, power and cold given human form. The moonlight behind him carved out the sharp lines of his shoulders and the severe cut of his jaw. It was the Alpha King. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen him only from a distance. A remote and intimidating figure during royal processions. To have him here, on her doorstep, was unthinkable. It was like a mountain deciding to visit a molehill. He stepped inside. The temperature in the room plummeted. She could see her own breath misting in the air. His eyes, she saw now, were not dark. They were the colour of ice on a deep lake, and they held an emptiness that was more terrifying than any rage. He did not look at her, not at first. His gaze was fixed on the tiny black pup cowering at her feet. The pup, despite its fear, let out a small, hopeful yip and took a wobbly step toward the formidable man. King Kyle's gaze finally lifted to hers. A flicker of something unreadable passed through those frozen eyes. He was tracking his pup's scent, she realized with a jolt of terror. But as he looked at her, he seemed to be sensing something else entirely. An unfamiliar warmth that was pushing back, ever so slightly, against the suffocating cold that clung to him like a shroud. It was the first time in a century he had felt anything other than the gnawing ice. It was faint, a ghost of a sensation, but it was there. And it came from her. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. It was the sound of stones grinding together. "You will come with me." It was not a command, though it was shaped like one. Beneath the layers of ice, deep in the locked-away core of his being, it was a desperate, instinctual plea. A moth drawn to a flame it did not understand. He needed that warmth. He needed to be near it. His survival suddenly, inexplicably, depended on it. Ilara was frozen, not by the unnatural chill he brought with him, but by the sheer shock. She looked from the terrifying king to the small pup, and then back to the king. She understood. This tiny, helpless creature was his, the son of the Alpha King. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her innate dignity refused to let her cower. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his icy gaze. He was alone, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He was cold. Kael's expression did not change, but something shifted in the oppressive atmosphere. It was her lack of fawning, her simple, direct statement of fact. She was not begging for her life or making excuses. She was explaining. He took another step into the room, his presence overwhelming the small space. He knelt, his movement stiff, and extended a hand. The pup scrambled toward him, licking his fingers with frantic affection. The king scooped up his son, cradling the small body in one large, careful hand. Then he looked at Ilara again, the strange, searching intensity back in his eyes. The warmth was stronger now, a shield against his eternal winter. "You will come with me," he repeated. This time, it was less an order and more a statement of unavoidable fact. He turned and walked out of her cottage, leaving the door hanging from a single broken hinge, not waiting to see if she would follow. He knew she would. The part of him that was still wolf, buried under a mountain of ice, had recognized a scent even more important than his son's. The scent of a mate. The scent of a thaw. Ilara stood motionless for a long moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cold in the room began to dissipate, leaving behind the lingering scent of winter and ozone. She had a choice. She could run, try to disappear into the night. But where would she go? He was the king. There was no corner of the world he could not reach. And a strange, unbidden thought surfaced. He hadn't been angry. He had been empty. And his eyes, for just a fraction of a second when he looked at her, had held a flicker of something that looked like desperation. She took a deep breath, grabbing her cloak from its hook. She stepped out of her ruined home and into the night, following the king who was a legend, a terror, and the father of the pup she had saved. She was walking away from the only life she had ever known and into the heart of the cold. The journey to the Isifang citadel was silent and swift. Royal guards materialized from the shadows, their faces grim and disciplined. A black carriage, devoid of any crest, waited on the road. Ilara was ushered inside, and the king followed, taking the seat opposite her. The pup, whose name she now knew was Kalen after his father, was curled asleep on the king's lap. The interior of the carriage was lined with dark velvet, but was as cold as a tomb. Ilara wrapped her cloak tighter around herself, but the chill seemed to seep into her bones. It was coming from him. She watched him in the dim light, his profile sharp and unmoving. He stared out the window, a statue of a man, lost in a world she could not imagine. She felt a strange pang of something that was not quite pity, but close to it. For all his power, he seemed utterly, profoundly alone. The Isifang citadel lived up to its name. It was a breathtaking fortress of white and grey stone that clawed at the sky. Beautiful and severe. But as they passed through the towering gates, a wave of cold washed over her, far more intense than what she'd felt in the cottage. The very stones of the castle seemed to radiate a deep, abiding frost. The servants who greeted them moved with silent efficiency, their eyes downcast, their faces pale with fear and the perpetual chill. She was led through vast, echoing halls, where tapestries depicted glorious battles of wolves and men, their vibrant colours muted by the gloom. There were no fires in the grand hearths, no laughter echoing in the corridors. There was only silence, stillness, and the cold. Kyle brought her to a suite of rooms high in one of the castle's towers. They were opulent, furnished with dark wood and rich fabrics, but they were as frigid and unwelcoming as the rest of the citadel. "These are your chambers," he stated, his voice flat. He placed the sleeping pup on a fur blanket by the unlit fireplace. "You will not be harmed. You will be provided for." He watched her, his head tilted slightly, as if she were a puzzle he could not solve. He was waiting for a reaction. Fear, gratitude, supplication. He was accustomed to those. Elara simply looked around the room, taking in the cold splendour. She met his gaze directly. "Why am I here, Your Majesty?" The question seemed to surprise him. No one questioned him. "You kept my son safe. You will be rewarded." "This is a reward?" The words were out before she could stop them. They were not meant to be insolent, merely honest. This gilded cage was colder and lonelier than her humble cottage. A flicker of something, annoyance, confusion, crossed his features before being swallowed by the ice. "It is." He turned to leave. "The pup," she called out. "He should not be alone." Kyle paused at the door. "He will be with you." He left without another word, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving her alone in the silent, freezing opulence. Days bled into a strange routine. Elara was a ghost in the castle. She had everything she could possibly need. Food, clothes, books, but she had no freedom. The pup, Kaelin, became her constant companion, a small, warm, living thing in the midst of all the cold, and the king watched her. She would feel his presence before she saw him. A drop in temperature, a prickling on her skin. He would stand in the archway of the library while she read, or watch from the far end of a gallery as she looked at the portraits of his ancestors. He never spoke. He just observed, his icy eyes following her every move. She learned to ignore him, just as she had learned to ignore the whispers in the market. She did not perform for him. She did not try to curry his favour. She hummed to Kaelin. She read the books she was given, and she looked out the frosted windows at a kingdom she could not reach. She noticed that in the rooms she spent the most time in, the chill seemed to recede. Just a little. The frost on the windows would melt in the centre, creating a small, clear circle through which to see the world. Her presence was an anomaly he could not comprehend. Her lack of fear was baffling. Her quiet dignity was a mystery. Every other person in his life, in his world, wanted something from him. Power, wealth, position. They feared him, and they used that fear to maneuver around him. Elara wanted nothing. She did not even seem to want to be here. And she was not afraid. The court, what little of it he tolerated, was beginning to notice. Whispers followed her when she was escorted through the halls. The Omega from the village. The king's strange pet. The opposition soon found its voice in Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor. He was a silver-haired wolf, sharp and cunning, his family having served the throne for generations. He requested an audience and was granted one in the king's private study, a room that was perpetually arctic. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his tone a careful blend of deference and concern. "The court is unsettled. Your guest. She is an omega of no standing. A distraction. To elevate her so is to invite instability. Kale sat behind a massive desk of black oak, his fingers steepled. The air around him was so cold that Valerius's words seemed to crystallize and hang in the air. She is a guest, Kale said, his voice dangerously quiet. A guest who shares the royal wing, Valerius pressed, emboldened. A guest who has the care of the royal heir. It is unseemly. It makes you look weak. The word hung in the air. Weak. It was the one accusation that could find a crack in Kyle's icy armor. His inability to shift, the secret shame he hid from the world, was a constant, gnawing source of that very fear. She is under my protection, Valerius. Kyle's voice dropped, and the temperature fell another 10 degrees. Question my judgment again, and you will find your position in this court to be quite unstable indeed. Valerius bowed, a cold smile touching his lips. Of course, your majesty. I speak only out of loyalty to the crown. He retreated, but the challenge had been made. The battle lines were drawn. That night, Elara could not sleep. The silence of the castle was heavier than usual. She left her chambers, pulling her cloak tight, and wandered. She found herself drawn to the one place she had seen a light burning under the door. The king's study. She pushed the door open a crack. The cold that spilled out was shocking, a physical force. Inside, Kyle stood with his back to her, staring into a massive hearth where a fire blazed. But the flames gave off no heat. They were pale and ghostly, licking at logs that never burned. And from where the king stood, a delicate, lethal lacework of frost was creeping across the marble floor, spreading like a disease. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine. This was not the posture of a powerful king. It was the posture of a man enduring agony. The profound loneliness she had sensed in him before returned tenfold, a wave of sorrow that was so strong it was almost her own. Her heart ached for him, for the powerful ruler who was a prisoner in his own skin. Forgetting all sense of propriety, of her own precarious position, she stepped fully into the room. Are you in pain, Your Majesty? The question was soft, yet it shattered the frozen silence. Kyle flinched as if struck. He turned slowly, his face a mask of shock. No one had ever asked him such a question. No one dared to look past the crown to see the man. They saw the power, the cold, the fear he inspired. They did not see the suffering. He looked at her, standing there in the doorway, her expression one of genuine, uncomplicated concern. There was no pity in her eyes, only empathy. And behind her, the hallway seemed warmer, the light from her rooms a soft golden glow that fought against the creeping dark of his study. That simple question, that look in her eyes, broke a dam that had stood for 100 years. The ice inside him cracked. Always, he whispered, the word a plume of white mist. It was the most honest thing he had said in a century. He sank into the chair behind his desk, the rigid control of his body failing him. The frost on the floor receded slightly, as if startled by the admission. It is a curse, he said, the words rusty from disuse. He told her everything. He told her of the vengeful fey sorcerer his ancestor had wronged, of the curse of endless winter placed upon his bloodline. A creeping frost that began in the heart and spread outward, devouring all emotion, all warmth, until nothing remained but a hollow, frozen shell. He told her how it had stolen his wolf, locking the beast away in a cage of internal ice. How he was slowly, inexorably freezing to death from the inside out. He spoke of the endless, silent years. The crushing weight of his crown and the utter, soul-destroying loneliness of his existence. He laid his ravaged soul bare for her, the unseen Omega, because she was the first person to ever simply ask, Ilara listened, her heart clenching with every word. She did not interrupt. She did not offer false hope or easy solutions. When he finally fell silent, the confession hanging in the frigid air between them, she saw not a king, but a man drowning in a silent, frozen ocean. She walked toward him, her steps sure and steady, until she stood before his desk. She did not offer a comforting touch. She knew instinctively he would flinch from it. Instead, she gave him the only thing she had, the only thing that mattered. The truth of her perception. "You must have been so alone." The words were simple. 6 simple words. But for Kale, they were a revelation. They were absolution. She did not see him as a monster, or a tragic figure, or a king to be pitied. She saw his loneliness. She saw the core of his suffering and named it. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, broken thing that was half a gasp, half a sob. A single, frozen tear escaped his eye and tracked a path down his cheek. Not melting, but clinging to his skin like a diamond. He felt a crack appear in the glacier around his heart. A painful, terrifying, wonderful crack. If you're enjoying this story and would like to see more like it, please take a moment to like this video. It helps me know what kind of tales you love to hear. In the quiet that followed his confession, a fragile bridge formed between them, spun from vulnerability and acceptance. Kyle began to seek her out, not as an observer, but as a companion. He would have his meals served not in his desolate hall, but in her chambers, where the air was always a few degrees warmer. He did not speak much. He did not know how, but he would sit and listen as she spoke of the forest, of the names of herbs, of simple things from a life he had never known. Her voice was a balm, a gentle warmth that soothed the ragged edges of his soul. One evening, she was reading to him from an old book of law in the vast, cold library. Kaelan was asleep on a cushion between them. Ilara's voice filled the silence, painting pictures of sun-drenched meadows and ancient, magical beasts. Kyle watched the way the candlelight softened the lines of her face, the quiet grace in the way she held the heavy tome. He felt an unfamiliar urge, a pull from deep within his frozen core. It was a desire for contact, for connection. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his gloved hand moving across the space between their chairs. His fingers brushed against the back of her hand, where it rested on the arm of her chair. Ilara paused in her reading, her breath catching. His touch was cold, even through the leather of his glove, but it was not the deathly chill of his castle. It was the cold of a living thing. For Kyle, the brief contact was a lightning strike. Through the glove, through the layers of ice, he felt a spark, a tiny, impossible flicker of warmth that travelled up his arm and straight to the cracked glacier around his heart. It was a feeling, a real, tangible feeling, the first in 100 years. It was more overwhelming, more potent than any display of power he had ever witnessed. It was hope. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his composure shattered. The hope was terrifying. It was a foreign invader in the sterile, predictable landscape of his suffering. Ilara saw the shock and fear in his eyes. She did not pull away or comment on the moment. She simply gave him a small, understanding smile and resumed reading, her voice a steady anchor in the storm that had just erupted inside him. But hope, he would learn, was a dangerous thing. It was a light that cast a deeper shadow. That night, the curse retaliated. Hope was its enemy. Feeling was its poison. The small spark of warmth Ilara had ignited in him was a declaration of war, and the ancient magic answered with overwhelming force. Kyle awoke in the dead of night with a scream locked in his throat. The cold, which had been a constant, gnawing presence, became a raging, violent blizzard inside him. It was an agony beyond anything he had ever known. It was not a slow freeze, it was a flash freezing, a brutal assault. He fell from his bed, his body convulsing. The frost that usually feathered the windows now sheeted them in thick, opaque ice. The very air in his chambers began to crystallize. Crystalline patterns of ice spread from his body, racing across the floor, up the walls, encasing his lavish prison in a tomb of his own making. He gasped for breath, but his lungs felt frozen solid. He could feel the ice spreading through his veins, sharp and serrated, locking his muscles, silencing his heart. The hope had made him vulnerable. It had reminded the curse what it was meant to destroy, and now it was doing so with vicious, final efficiency. Ilara awoke with a jolt, a primal scream echoing in her mind. It was his. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt his pain as if it were a physical blow. The unnatural cold that flooded the corridor from the direction of his room was a tangible wave of despair. Throwing a cloak over her nightdress, she ran. The guards outside his door were frozen in place, their faces masks of terror, their armor coated in a thick layer of rime. She didn't hesitate. She threw her shoulder against the massive ice-encrusted doors. They wouldn't budge. "Kale!" She screamed, her voice raw. Inside, he heard her. Her voice was a distant point of warmth in the howling Arctic storm of his agony. It was the only thing left in the world. He fought, clawing his way back from the brink, pushing against the final fatal freeze. With the last of his strength, he focused his will on the door, and the ice encasing it cracked and fell away. Ilara stumbled inside and gasped in horror. The room was a crystalline cavern. Kyle lay on the floor, his skin a deathly shade of grey, his lips blue. Ice crawled over his skin, his hair, his clothes. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He was dying. She rushed to his side, falling to her knees. She reached for him, but a voice, cold and sharp, cut through the air. "I would not do that if I were you." Lord Valerius stood in the doorway, flanked by two of his own personal guards. He looked at the dying king not with alarm, but with a chilling, triumphant satisfaction. "What have you done?" Ilara breathed, her eyes wide with fury. "I have done nothing," Valerius said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "The curse is simply running its course. A course my family has been tasked with overseeing for generations." He stepped further into the room, holding up a small, dark amulet that seemed to absorb the light. It pulsed with a malevolent cold. "The sorcerer who laid this curse was my ancestor. He bound my line to it to ensure the Alpha Kings of the Isafang would never again know the warmth of a mate, the strength of their wolf, or the fire of true emotion. They were to be powerful, yes, but hollow. Controllable." He sneered down at Kael's fading form. He was becoming difficult. "Feeling things. Hoping you," he said, his gaze landing on Ilara with pure venom, "are an unfortunate complication. You were accelerating his recovery. I am simply accelerating his decline." Kael's eyes fluttered open, fixing on Valerius. A low growl, the first he had managed in a century, rumbled in his chest, but it was weak, choked with ice. "It is over, Your Majesty," Valerius said calmly. "The reign of ice will end, and a new, warmer era will begin. Under my rule," he signalled to his guards. "Remove her." But as the guards moved toward Ilara, something within her broke. The sight of Kyle, the man who had confessed his lonely soul to her, being consumed by this cold darkness, the arrogant triumph on Valerius's face, it ignited a fire she never knew she possessed. A desperate, primal love surged through her, a refusal to let him die, a refusal to let the cold win. She looked at Kyle, at his fading light, and she knew what she had to do. Her warmth, the strange quality that melted the frost on windows and soothed his troubled spirit, was not just a quirk of her personality. It was a power. It was the answer, the antithesis to his curse. Ignoring the guards, ignoring Valerius's command, she placed her hands on Kyle's chest, right over his frozen heart. No, she whispered, a vow to him, to the world, to the ancient curse itself. She closed her eyes and poured herself into him. Not just her body heat, but her life force, her spirit, the innate, sun-drenched core of her being. She imagined every warm memory she had, the sun on her face as a child, the heat of the hearth in winter, the comforting weight of the pup in her arms. She funneled all of it, all of her love, all of her light, into the man under her hands. A radiant, golden light exploded from her, so bright it forced Valerius and his men to shield their eyes. It was not a fire that burned, it was a warmth that healed. A pure, unconditional love made manifest. The light slammed into the encroaching ice, and the two forces met in a silent, titanic struggle. Valerius stared, his smug confidence evaporating into pure disbelief. What is this? What are you? Elara didn't hear him. Her entire world was Kyle. She could feel the curse fighting back. A sentient coldness trying to devour her warmth, but she held firm. In a distant part of the castle, the pup Kalen, connected to them both, let out a long, piercing howl, adding his own nascent, untamed power to the torrent. Valerius, seeing his victory slipping away, drew a dagger. Stop this. He is meant to die. He lunged, not at KL, but at her, the source of the light. She was faced with a choice: defend herself, turn her power on Valerius, or continue to pour every ounce of her being into saving Kyle. But it was not a choice at all. Vengeance was a cold thing. She was made of warmth. Her focus remained absolute, her love unwavering. Just as the dagger was about to strike, a grey arm shot out and caught Valerius's wrist in a crushing grip. Kyle was on his feet. The golden light had shattered the curse. The ice had not just melted, it had been annihilated. Colour flooded Kyle's skin, the vibrant, living flush of a healthy man. The deathly grey was gone. The frost on the walls vanished. And his eyes were no longer chips of ice. They were a warm, deep grey, blazing with a century of stolen life. He felt everything, the cold stone of the floor beneath his bare feet, the lingering agony of the curse's death throes, the rough fabric of Ilara's cloak, and above all, an overwhelming tidal wave of love for the woman who had saved him, a love so powerful it brought him to his knees. With the curse broken, his true power, the full, unbridled might of the Alpha King, surged back in a cataclysmic flood. It was not the cold, oppressive power from before. This was a living, breathing force of nature. He snapped Valerius's wrist with a flick of his own, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. The treacherous lord crumpled, screaming. Kyle didn't spare him another glance. He turned to Elara, who swayed on her feet, drained from her effort. He caught her, pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. Elara. He breathed her name, and it was a prayer. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the frantic beat of her heart against his. He could feel his own heart, beating strong and true for the first time he could remember. In front of the cowering traitor and the stunned castle guards who had gathered, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of gratitude. It was a kiss of soul-deep recognition, of a bond reforged in fire and ice. It was a declaration. When he finally pulled back, he looked down at her, his grey eyes shining. Mine, he growled, a possessive, primal sound that was pure wolf. Then his voice softened. I love you. The guards, loyal to their true king, seized the whimpering Valerius, dragging him away to the dungeons. The long winter was over. Later that night, after the citadel had settled into a new, hopeful quiet, Kyle led Ilara to the highest balcony. The moon was full and bright. "There is one more thing the curse stole from me," he said, his hand warm in hers. He closed his eyes, and a powerful ripple went through him. His form shifted, bones elongating, fur sprouting. Where the king had stood, there now was a magnificent black wolf, larger than any she had ever seen. His eyes, the same warm, intelligent grey. He had his other half back. He nudged her hand with his nose, a clear invitation, and for the first time, Ilara felt a stir within herself, a whisper of a forgotten heritage, a pull to the wild, a resonance with the wolf before her. She did not shift, but she understood. They ran together that night, he in his true form and she in hers, two souls finally whole, under the light of the moon. Their union was declared not by law or ceremony, but by the undeniable truth of their matched spirits. 3 months later, the Isafang citadel was a memory. It was now called Sunstone Citadel, and it lived up to its new name. The oppressive cold was gone, replaced by a gentle lingering warmth. Sunlight streamed through windows that were no longer frosted over. Laughter, a sound unheard for a century, now echoed in the halls. Flowers, coaxed by Ilara's care, bloomed in vibrant profusion in the courtyards. Ilara sat with Kael in a sun-drenched garden, a book resting forgotten in her lap. His arm was wrapped around her, his presence a constant, reassuring warmth. At their feet, Kaelin, now a lanky, half-grown pup, chewed playfully on a fallen twig. Kael was no longer a feared king. He was a beloved one. His rule, now tempered with the compassion and emotion Ilara had unlocked in him, had brought a new era of prosperity to the kingdom. A servant approached with a deferential bow, holding a single letter on a silver tray. "A message for the Queen, Your Majesty." The title still felt strange to Ilara, but she accepted the letter. The seal was that of her former village council. She broke it, her expression calm. It was not from the council, but from her sister Lyra. The words were a stilted, awkward mix of congratulations and feigned remorse, ending with a thinly veiled request for a position at court for herself. It was a plea from a world that no longer had any claim on her. Ilara read the letter, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. She felt no anger, no triumph, only a distant sort of pity for a sister who still believed that status and position were the measures of a person's worth. She folded the letter and set it on the table beside her, letting a gentle breeze catch it and carry it away. It was a piece of a past that had no power here. Kael watched her, his love for her a palpable thing. "Bad news?" he asked softly. Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes on the blue sky. "No," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound contentment. No news at all. She was not an outcast. She was not a disgrace. She was a queen. She was a mate. She was loved. She was home. Where are you listening from today? I love hearing your thoughts on the story in the comments below. And if you'd like to join us for more tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.